Hello, y'all. It's me. It's Dr. G, and welcome back to Star-Spangled Studies. Picture this. You're in Cane Ridge, Kentucky, on the edge of the American frontier, but you are not alone. As far as the eye can see, there are people, 10, maybe 20,000 of them. The air is thick with smoke from 100 campfires and the sound of a dozen preachers all shouting at once from makeshift pulpits of tree stumps and wagons. People are crying, they're jumping, some are speaking in tongues, others faint dead away, overcome by the sheer power of the moment. This wasn't just church. This was a religious wildfire. This was the Second Great Awakening. So what's going on here? What lit the spiritual fuse that would burn its way across the entire nation? The early 19th century was an age of anxiety and optimism all at once. The country was expanding, the economy was transforming, democracy was spreading, well, at least for white men. Westward expansion, industrialization, and a flood of immigration were radically altering how Americans saw themselves and their community. Amidst this dizzying change, Americans began to ask themselves a profound question. Could we, as individuals and a nation, become perfect? Could we build a literal heaven on earth? The answer for millions was a resounding yes, and that belief would set in motion a tidal wave of reform that would change everything from the bottle to the ballot box to the very chains of slavery itself. I'm Dr. G. Let's go. The heart of this firestorm was a fundamental revolution in American religious thought. For generations, the dominant theology, especially in New England, was a stern, unyielding Calvinism. Calvinists believed that all humankind was hopelessly marred by sin and that an omnipotent God had already decided, or predestined, who would be saved and who would be damned long before they were ever born. This was the faith of grim acceptance, where human action meant little in the face of divine decree. The Second Great Awakening, however, flipped this script completely on its head. It preached a new gospel, very empowering, because it emphasized that human action and individual choice was what actually mattered. The most influential voice of this new theology was a former lawyer who had turned into a fiery activist and revivalist named Charles Grandison Finney. Finney argued that sin was not an inescapable stain on one's soul, but that it was actually a voluntary act. Therefore, salvation wasn't a lottery ticket handed out by God at the beginning of time long before you were born. Salvation was a choice that any individual could make right here, right now. We can hear this radical message of human agency in Finney's own words themselves. He saw conversion not as some mysterious lightning strike, but as a rational decision taken on by humans. He challenged his listeners directly, telling them, quote, God requires you to turn, and what he requires of you, he cannot do for you, end quote. These words were revolutionary at the time. It took spiritual destiny out of the hands of an inscrutable God and placed it firmly in the hands of the individual. So this new theology of spiritual empowerment resonated perfectly hand in hand with the new democratic spirit of the age that we have been talking about in previous episodes. So it's no surprise then that the biggest winners of the Second Great Awakening, if we can call them that, were the denominations that championed it. Those like the Methodists and the Baptists. With their populist structures, their use of itinerant or circuit riding preachers who could reach remote frontier settlements, their passionate, emotional style of worship and preaching, these groups exploded in popularity. Meanwhile, the older, more formal and hierarchical churches like the Episcopalians and the Congregationalists, with their university-trained ministers and formal liturgies, saw their influence wane in this period. Its very style of the revival itself was democratic. These massive outdoor camp meetings, like the one I described at Cane Ridge, brought together people from all social classes. Preachers were often ordinary men without the formal training. They were valued for their piety and their passion rather than their educational or economic credentials. In a striking break from tradition, women took on prominent public roles as well, often exhorting the crowds and sharing their testimonies, claiming a spiritual place and a spiritual authority in a society that otherwise denied them this. This connection between religious and political change was no coincidence. The spiritual egalitarianism of the revival dovetailed perfectly with the political egalitarianism professed in the Jacksonian America. The old Calvinist model of predestination, with its fixed spiritual hierarchy, mirrored an older, more deferential social and political order that was not in time with the times. The new message of the era, this evangelical message that any individual could choose salvation, was the spiritual twin of the Jacksonian political message that any white man could and should participate in his own governance. The idea that you could save your own soul was just as empowering as the idea that your vote mattered. This synergy created a perfect and powerful cultural feedback loop, fueling a belief that if individuals could perfect themselves, then they could certainly perfect their society. Historians love to argue and debate over big questions and little questions, and one big question that comes out of this Second Great Awakening and religious reform is, was this all genuine spiritual revival, or was something else going on? A prominent school of thought, particularly influential from the 60s through the 1980s, interprets these revivals as, at least in some small part, a mechanism of social control. The argument goes something like this. As the market revolution created social and economic chaos, a new middle class of managers, clerks, and business owners felt a deep anxiety about the future. They embraced the new evangelicalism of this powerful emphasis on self-discipline, sobriety, industry, and order. They then promoted this faith into the growing and often unruly urban working class. It was a way to instill middle-class values in their employees, creating a more stable, sober, and productive workforce to serve the new industrial economy. So was it a heartfelt quest for God or a clever tool for class discipline? The truth is, as often is the case we've seen in previous episodes, somewhere in that complicated, messy middle ground. This spiritual fire became so intense in some places, like the Erie Canal corridor of upstate New York, that preachers like Finney declared there were no more souls there left to convert. The region, he said, had been so thoroughly scorched by the flames of revival that it was now what he called a burned-over district. But this fire couldn't be contained in traditional churches. It leapt from the revival tent into the philosopher's study and the utopian commune, sparking radical new visions for American life. The burned-over district was more than just a site of revivals. It was a laboratory of religious innovation. The same energy, the spiritual energy that fueled Methodist camp meetings also gave rise to entirely new religions and radical social experiments. It was in this environment that a young Joseph Smith claimed to have received visions from God and angelic beings, leading him to publish the Book of Mormon in 1830 and organize the Church of Christ, later named the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons. Other groups, convinced that society was too corrupt to be saved, chose to withdraw and build their own miniature heavens on earth. These utopian communities experimented with the most fundamental aspects of human life: sex, family, and property. The United Society of Believers in Christ's second appearing, better known as the Shakers, practiced strict celibacy, believing that the world was nearing its end. They lived in tightly knit communities, holding all property in common and becoming famous for their ecstatic worship services and their simple, beautiful, and functional furniture and design. In stark contrast to that was the Oneida community, founded by John Humphrey Noyes in New York. Now, Noyes preached a doctrine of perfectionism, believing that true converts could become free of sin. He took this to his logical and, for most Americans, shocking conclusion. The Oneidans rejected traditional marriage, which they saw as a form of selfish ownership, in favor of a complex marriage, a carefully regulated system of free love where every man was effectively married to every woman, and vice versa. If the Shakers and Oneidans represented the social frontier of the reform impulse, Transcendentalism was the intellectual and philosophical edge. Centered in the New England area, this movement included some of the most famous names in American literature: Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Margaret Fuller. Many were former Unitarian ministers who found that even that liberal faith was too confining. They broke away to forge a new spiritual path based not on scripture or doctrine, but on personal intuition. Their core belief was in a divine universal spirit, which Emerson called the Oversoul, which connected every person to God and to nature. Truth wasn't something to be found in a holy book or in a Sunday sermon. It was something to be experienced directly through introspection, through your individual consciousness, and a deep communion with the natural world. Emerson urged Americans to stop looking to Europe for their culture and ideas and to trust the divinity here and within themselves. In his 1841 lecture, The Transcendentalist, he defined the idealist as one who insisted on, quote, the power of thought and of will, on inspiration, on miracle, on individual, end quote. His most famous call was for radical self-reliance, for rejecting the soul-killing pressure of conformity. In his essay Nature, he described a mystical experience of becoming one with the universe. This intense focus on individualism, however, created a fascinating tension within the broader reform movement as a whole. While Transcendentalism grew from the same perfectionist soil as abolitionism and temperance, which we'll talk about in a minute, its primary focus was on self-reform rather than social reform. The first and most important project of a transcendentalist was not to change the world, but to change oneself. This helps explain why some of its leading figures were initially hesitant to join the organized, collective reform movements of the day. When fellow transcendentalist George Ripley founded the utopian community Brook Farm in 1841, Emerson politely declined to join. He explained that he still had far to travel on his own personal spiritual journey before he could get so directly involved with the reformation of others' lives and society. The ultimate expression of this impulse was, of course, Henry David Thoreau's 2-year retreat at a cabin at Walden Pond. He went to the woods to, quote, live deliberately, to strip down to its essentials and reform himself, arguing that any meaningful society change had to begin with the individual. It was only as the national crisis over slavery deepened in the 1850s that figures like Emerson and Thoreau became more outspoken activists, concluding that some social evils like slavery were so profoundly corrupting that they made individual purity impossible. For many reformers, however, perfecting the self was only the first step. The ultimate goal was to perfect society by declaring war on society's sins. They formed what has been called a benevolent empire to wage this war, and their first target was a foe found nearly in every American town: the alcohol mob. by the righteous zeal of the Second Great Awakening, reformers created a vast network of voluntary societies aimed at eradicating social ills to create that perfect society. This interconnected web of organizations became known as the Benevolent Empire. Its soldiers were the new, pious middle class, and they waged war on a dozen fronts. They sought to reform prisons, to build asylums for the mentally ill, a crusade famously led by Dorothea Dix, as well as to promote public education, to distribute Bibles, and to stamp out prostitution. Their greatest and most immediate success came in the war against alcohol. In the early 19th century, Americans drank staggering amounts of liquor, far more than they do today. And it's understandable why. When you could drink water and get any number of diseases, drinking water itself wasn't a good social choice for you personally or for society around you. But if you distilled that water and made alcohol from it, somehow you didn't catch all of those diseases. So drinking alcohol in that sense made sense. Now, reformers, many of them women, linked this rampant consumption to everything they saw that was wrong with society. Alcohol abuse led to poverty, domestic violence, crime, and economic inefficiency. The American Temperance Society, founded in 1826, now grew to have over 200,000 members. They used powerful propaganda, including graphic lithographs by artists like Nathaniel Currier that contrasted the disease-broken families of intemperance with the prosperous, happy, church-going families of temperance. The movement was successful. It was stunningly successful, and it helped to cut the average American's alcohol consumption by half during the 1930s. But perhaps the most divisive, the most dangerous, and ultimately the most consequential of reform movements was the one aimed directly at destroying slavery, and that would be abolition. For decades, the mainstream anti-slavery movement had been dominated by cautious people that we would call gradualists, who advocated for a slow, compensated end to slavery, and by supporters of the American Colonization Society, which proposed sending freed African Americans back to Africa. This latter plan, while popular with some prominent politicians, was fiercely condemned by most Black Americans as a racist scheme designed to get rid of them, of its free Black population. The 1830s, however, marked a dramatic and crucial turning point. The movement for abolition shifted from gradualism to immediatism, or immediate abolition. The new radical demand was not for a slow, managed decline of slavery over several generations, but for its immediate, unconditional, and uncompensated abolition. Slavery was not a problem to be managed. It was a sin to be eradicated now. The standard narrative on this shift too often centers on white abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, but this misses a very crucial part of the story. The move to immediatism was profoundly influenced and in many ways directly caused by the powerful and uncompromising voices of Black abolitionists who shamed and inspired their white counterparts into adopting a more radical stance. In the 1820s, Garrison himself was a supporter of gradualism and of colonization. But by the end of that decade, in 1829, a free Black man in Boston named David Walker published his Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. Walker's appeal was a thunderous denunciation of American hypocrisy, a scathing attack on colonization, and a warning that God's justice would bring violence to the slaveholding states of the South. It was a revolutionary call for Black pride, for unity, and resistance to the slave states. Walker's words and those of other Black Northerners like James Forten had a transformative effect, and the historical record is clear. Reading these tracts changed Garrison's mind. Just 2 years after Walker's appeal, on January 1st, 1831, Garrison launched his own abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. In its very first issue, he made a stunning and public reversal, issuing an unequivocal recantation, his words, of his former gradualist views. He wrote that he had publicly, quote, Ask pardon of my God, of my country, and of my brethren, the poor slaves, for having uttered a sentiment so full of timidity, injustice, and absurdity." End quote. The radicalization of the white-led abolitionist movement, therefore, was not simply an internal evolution. It was a direct response to the moral and intellectual leadership of black activists who refused to compromise on the issue of their own freedom. The most powerful of all voices belonged to a man who had lived slavery's horrors and escaped its grasp. Frederick Douglass, a brilliant writer and one of the 19th century's greatest orators, delivered a speech in Rochester, New York on July 5, 1852 that laid bare the nation's soul. Standing before the white audience gathered to celebrate American independence, he asked a searing question of them: "What, to the slave, is your 4th of July?" And he answered his own question with breathtaking force. Quote, "Fellow citizens, pardon me. Allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar, and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulted from your independence to us? I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not me. The sunlight that brought light and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. The 4th July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems where inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak this day?" End quote. And he goes on to say even more. Allow me to quote in depth. Quote, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. The sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants brash-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgiving, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is no nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour." End quote. As you would imagine, this new uncompromising radicalism provoked a furious backlash. Abolitionist presses were destroyed, and activists like Elijah Lovejoy were murdered by pro-slavery mobs in the North. In Washington, a bipartisan coalition of Congress passed the gag rule, which automatically tabled any position and petition related to slavery without it even being read on the Congress floor, a direct assault on abolitionist freedom of speech. This fight for freedom forced many to ask a critical question: freedom for whom? As women poured their heart, soul, and labor into the abolitionist cause, they began to look at their own lives, their own lack of rights for women, their own legal subjugation, and recognize their own chains. The battle to end slavery was about to ignite another rebellion, one that began at a tea party. In antebellum America, the lives of most white middle-class women were governed by the powerful ideology that historians call the cult of domesticity or the cult of true womanhood. Women were expected to embody 4 cardinal virtues: piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. Their proper sphere was the home, where they were tasked with being the spiritual guardians of the family, raising virtuous children, and creating a haven from the corrupting influences of the outside world. This cultural ideal was reinforced by a harsh legal reality. Under the ancient legal doctrine of coverture, a married woman had no separate legal identity from her husband. Her legal existence was covered by his existence. He gained legal control over any property she owned when they married, any wages she earned, and had legal authority over their children. As the Declaration of Sentiments would later put it, in the eyes of the law, a married woman was, quote, civilly dead. Ironically, women skillfully used this very ideology that confined them to the home to fashion a public role for themselves. If they were society's designated moral guardians, then wasn't it their duty to confront the moral evils plaguing the nation? This logic propelled thousands of women in this time period into the reform movements of the Benevolent Empire, especially temperance and abolition. So the link then to the fighting to end slavery and the fight to gain women's rights was a direct, personal, powerful link. Women like Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, and the remarkable Grimké sisters, Sarah and Angelina, were tireless and effective abolitionist speakers and organizers. As they worked to break the chains of the enslaved men and women in the South, they were constantly confronted by their own chains as women. They were criticized, they were heckled, they were condemned by ministers and community leaders for speaking in public, for daring to step outside of their, quote, proper domestic sphere. This opposition led them to a profound realization. They saw the direct parallel between the subjugation of black enslaved people and the subjugation of women. As Sarah Grimké powerfully argued, quote, whatever is morally right for a man to do is morally right for a woman to do. The final straw came at the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. After traveling across the Atlantic, the American female delegates, including Lucretia Mott and a young Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were denied seats and barred from participating simply because they were women. Outraged, it was there in London that they resolved to hold a convention in the United States to discuss the rights of women. And that brings us to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. That idea, born out of being disrespected in London, came to fruition 8 years later. At a tea party at the home of Jane Hunt in Waterloo, New York, Stanton, Mott, and a few other women decided that the time was now. They placed an ad in a local paper, and on July 19, 1848, about 300 people, mostly from the surrounding area, gathered in the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls for the first ever convention on women's rights. The centerpiece of the convention was the Declaration of Sentiments, a document primarily drafted by Stanton. It was a stroke of rhetorical genius. She deliberately modeled it on the Declaration of Independence to link the cause of women's rights directly to the nation's most sacred founding ideals. But it began with a revolutionary edit. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, end quote. The document then laid out a long list of, quote, repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards woman, which included denying her the right to vote, the right to her own property and wages, and access to education and profitable employments, all with the direct object of establishing, quote, an absolute tyranny over her, end quote. The convention passed a series of resolutions, but one was far more controversial than all others: the demand for suffrage, the right to vote. The idea was so radical at the time that even the progressive Lucretia Mott feared it would make the entire convention look ridiculous. The resolution was on the verge of failing until one man stood up to speak in its defense, none other than Frederick Douglass. His passionate argument swayed the crowd, and the resolution passed by a narrow margin. For more than a century, the Seneca Falls Convention was enshrined in American history as the unambiguous singular starting point of the organized women's rights movement. But in recent decades, some historians have challenged this narrative, with scholars like Lisa Tetrault going so far as to call it the myth of Seneca Falls. The argument is not that the convention didn't happen or that it wasn't important, rather that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who were brilliant strategists and masterful historians of their own movement, later constructed an origin story that deliberately placed their convention at the absolute center of the struggle. This powerful narrative shaping helped unify their wing of the suffrage movement and wrote a clear, heroic, and politically useful history. Other historians, like Rosemarie Zagari, argued that the debate over women's political rights actually began much earlier, in the ferment of the American Revolution itself. So was the Seneca Falls birthplace of American feminism, or was it a pivotal watershed moment? Was it an powerful and enduring symbol created in hindsight? It's a debate that reminds us, as again we've seen, that history is not about what happens, or just about what happens, but is also about the stories we choose to tell about it later. Regardless, though, these reformers, the preachers, the philosophers, the abolitionists, and the feminists, in their quest for a more perfect nation, had unleashed forces of liberation that would reshape the United States. But even as they fought for the nation's soul in the North, a different kind of revolution was solidifying its power in the South. It was a revolution of production, of wealth, and of human bondage, a kingdom built not on ideals but on a simple white fiber that was tightening its grip on the nation and the world. So next time on Star-Spangled Studies, we are going to descend into the heart of the South, into the heart of King Cotton, and we're going to explore another revolution of the 19th century, the Cotton Revolution. I'm Dr. G, and I'll see y'all in the past.